By the early 1960s, the USSR was recovering from Stalinism and beginning to enter the modern era. On April 12, 1961, Soviet scientists and engineers were able to send the first man into space. Despite this leap in technology, the outlook of the Soviet Union was bleak. There were increasing problems with the decline of economic growth, which in turn was further exacerbated by the dysfunctional politics of the ruling elite. Adding to the economic problem was the fact the Soviet Union's product quality was decreasing due to the younger, more rebellious working class that would refuse to work full hours because of the Soviet Union's policy to pay every worker equally, regardless of the time spent working and the quality of their work. Due to these shortfalls in worker policy, the product quality of the Soviet Union plummeted drastically. 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev stepped into Soviet Union issues of poverty, lack of freedom in media and speech, and the Eastern Bloc countries' protests for individuality. Due to these shortfalls of his predecessors, Gorbachev began a series of reforms that targeted shortfalls in freedom, government structure, and began removal of defunct leaders and laws. These reforms were Glasnost, openness in practice and policy, and Perestroika, Gorbachev's policy of reconstruction. Glasnost and Perestroika's effects on the Soviet Union included rapid moves towards democratization, more liberal rights and laws, riots in pro-communist countries, the Tiananmen Square crackdown, the removal of the Berlin Wall, the seceding of the Eastern Bloc countries from the Soviet Union, more open trade with the West, the end of the Cold War, the fall of the USSR, and the beginning of democracy in Russia. Mikhail Gorbachev was born March 2, 1931, in Provolnen-Krasnoyardeski district, Stavropol, in the North Caucasus. In 1952, he joined the CPSU, the Soviet Union's Communist Party. While in the CPSU, Gorbachev returned to Stavropol, where he began a career as a lawyer for the Communist Party. Then, after a successful career in law, Gorbachev was appointed first Secretary of Agriculture of the Stavropol region. Following his accomplishments in 1978, he was given the position of Secretary of Agriculture of the Soviet Central Committee, and left Stavropol for his position in Moscow. While in Moscow, Gorbachev began to see that the Soviet system of power and leadership was the real cause of the problems in the Soviet Union, and under the new General Secretary, Leonid Brezhnev, old Stalinist ways weren't changing. In 1980, Secretary Gorbachev became a member of the Politburo, the supreme lawmaking body of the Soviet Union and the most influential group in the USSR. On November 10, 1982, Brezhnev died, bringing Gorbachev one step closer to the position of General Secretary, but before him were his mentor, Yuri Andropov, and Yuri's successor, Konstantin Chernenko. Andropov died on the 9th of February, 1984. He was quickly followed by Konstantin Chernenko on March 10, 1985. It was finally Gorbachev's time to step into the world stage. As newly appointed General Secretary, Gorbachev was tasked with the responsibilities of pulling the Soviet Union into the modern world and reforming the Soviet people's rights. During the short-lived Gorbachev era, many changes occurred in the Soviet state. While in power, Gorbachev targeted shortfalls in freedom and government structure, the removal of inefficient leaders and laws, and then began to open up the rights of the Soviet people. We talked to an ex-Soviet citizen that explained the pre-Glasnost travel procedure. This is what she had to say.
Well, that is actually a very, very complicated process. And my family was one of the last to be able to leave before the period that became known as the refuseniks. So I left in 1979, and throughout the 70s there was a huge wave of Jewish immigration, and they were just basically letting out anybody who had a sponsor and who was able to say that they were Jewish and could get an entry visa into Israel. By the 1979, they started clamping down on that. But the process starts with you applying to the government for an exit visa. When you do, you basically relinquish your citizenship. So as soon as they give you the exit visa, you have like a very short amount of time to get all your stuff and leave. And you can't take a lot of stuff with you. So for example, you can't take anything that was made before like 1945. So whatever family heirlooms, like my grandmother's jewelry, plates, my parents' Steinway piano, you can't take any of that with you, because it's considered a national treasure. So you have to get rid of all your belongings, and you give in your passport, and if you wind up somehow not getting on that train or airplane, then basically you can be arrested for for being there without a permit.
As Glasnost and Perestroika were introduced to the Soviet system, the culture of the USSR seemed to change almost overnight. As more freedom of speech and expression spread throughout the Union, new music genres were created and clothing became more vivid among the younger generations. Because of this radical change in culture, many people felt uneasy or insecure with the new reforms. To help stem the unease, Gorbachev would mingle in the streets with people to get their opinions about his radical reforms. As Glasnost and Perestroika progressed, they began to cover travel freedoms and freedoms in religion, gaining greater popularity with the people and with the leaders of other nations. The more Glasnost and Perestroika grew, the more the Soviet states wanted greater freedom and eventually independence from the Union. Because of the freedom of media, many countries in the USSR began to use uncensored media to promote independence in the Eastern Bloc and cause unrest in Moscow. Another major accomplishment of Glasnost and Perestroika was the reunion of East and West Germany and the lifting of the Iron Curtain. The Berlin Wall was erected almost overnight and divided the German city of Berlin into the NATO side and the USSR side. Hundreds of people died trying to cross over to the western side to see their families. After numerous talks with the US President Ronald Reagan, Gorbachev allowed for the Berlin Wall to be torn down and for Soviet travel restrictions to be lifted. Although some shortfalls in Gorbachev's planning had occurred, he remained optimistic about his reforms. As Glasnost and Perestroika pulled the USSR into the modern world, Gorbachev worked hard to end the Cold War with the United States and began to disarm the Soviet arsenal and lead to peace with the West. Even though Glasnost and Perestroika were peacefully sweeping the USSR, that wasn't the case in Communist China. On June 3, 1989, after 7 weeks of protesting, hundreds of thousands of students, factory workers, teachers, and professors were camped in Tiananmen Square while they protested for democratic individuality. On the 4th of June, 1989, the Chinese government sent 300,000 soldiers and police to break up the protest. Estimates put the death toll at about 2,600 civilians and as many as 7,000 injuries, both civilian and military. The more Western leaders applauded Gorbachev for his reforms, he began to realize that Glasnost and Perestroika, his bold, courageous, and visionary ideas had become an unstoppable force. On August 19, 1991, 8 hardline communists planned a coup against Gorbachev and sent 2 tank divisions as well as paratroopers to remove Gorbachev from office and secure the Soviet White House. After Gorbachev was ousted from office after the coup, the Soviet Union dissolved into their respective states. After the USSR dissolved, the Russian President Boris Yeltsin began to work to rebuild the Russian government and promote democracy for the people. The more Yeltsin introduced the new alien ideas of democracy to the people, they began to feel uncomfortable with democracy and the challenges of poverty that they experienced during the beginning of the Reconstruction period. Even now, Russia hasn't become fully democratic and is still struggling with many problems Gorbachev aimed to solve, including restriction of drugs and alcohol, unemployment, poverty, and to create first world conditions in Russia. We received letters from some ex-Soviet citizens from the Jewish Community Center that explained Gorbachev's reforms.
Perestroika is a special period in the USSR. Before Perestroika, our country was closed country for foreign people. Between the Soviet Union and USA, there was a Cold War. We hated Americans and they hated us. Gorbachev was first General Secretary who opened Iron Curtain before Soviet people and foreign people. We built a new politic with other countries. Perestroika is rebuilding our economic and international connection, our ideology. Another one said, "At the beginning, all people in the USSR understood that our life had to change. The political system was not democratic, economic life went down. All in the country need to change. So it was euphoria when Gorbachev came to us. He was much younger than all who was in authorities before, but 3 years later, all of us could see that nobody in Communist Party knows what to do to change. So confusion and disorder began. Disorder in economics made us live without food. Disorder in power made a result that is biggest. The largest country in the world collapsed. New countries began to live separated."
Glasnost and Perestroika has created major impacts in history and significantly reformed the Soviet people's rights. They ended the Cold War and reunited East and West Germany. They began the fight for democracy in the East and repaired relations with the Soviet Union and many NATO countries. They allowed for modernization in the USSR and the elimination of the old Stalinist ways. They gave people the ability to have free will, speech, and ideas without the looming threat of military crackdown. But most importantly, they liberated and oppressed people from the restrictions of their rights and allowed them to begin the 21st century as free people.